Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar titled Early US Reimbursement and Market Access Planning. It's not optional. It's great to see so many of you joining us today on the webinar, and I hope all of your friends, family, and colleagues are continue to keep safe and well. My name is Josh Dance. I'm Senior Vice President with LSX Leaders based in London, and delighted to be hosting today's webinar, which is the second in our Medical Device Innovation Series in partnership with MUCRA. As with the first webinar we ran 3 weeks ago, we have a lot of our own community who are joining us today, but also a number of new people to us and from our other networks. So before we kick off, I just want to very briefly introduce LSX for those who don't know us. LSX stands for Life Science Executives. We're a community and network of life science decision makers across biotech, medtech, and health tech businesses, pharma companies, the full range of the investor base in life sciences, as well as payers, providers, and other key stakeholders in the healthcare sector. Many people know us for our high-level, large-scale conferences, partnering events, and showcases that we run in Europe and the US. And while these physical events are off the table for this short period, we're really pleased to be able to continue connecting people, sharing expertise of our community through the other arm of our business, which is virtual partnering and various forms of digital content delivery, such as today's webinar. So we're delighted to be working with MUCRA again for today's session, and indeed the whole series. As a leading advisory firm and CRO for the medical device sector, with experience across regulatory, reimbursement, clinical research, healthcare compliance, and quality assurance, they're the perfect partners for the medical device series. Today, we're going to be focusing on one of these areas specifically, which is reimbursement. And you're going to be very shortly handing over, I'll be handing over to our speaker and presenter for today, Tonya Dowd, Vice President of Reimbursement, Health Economics and Market Access with MUCRA. Just going to allow another quick minutes for any latecomers to join before I hand over to Tonya, who'll be guiding through today's session. Tonya has 30 plus years of experience in reimbursement, health economics, and market access, and is an expert in upstream product plan development and downstream execution of reimbursement strategies. As you said, various experience in healthcare companies, and is the former global franchise director of healthcare economics and market access within Johnson & Johnson's medical device division. A couple of quick points to mention in terms of the sort of format of today's webinar. We will have the opportunity at the end of the presentation for me to put any questions that you might have that have come up through the presentation to Tonya, and I'd encourage you to all please make sure you make use of that time and answer, or ask any questions, I should say, that Tonya can then answer. There is a Q&A section at the bottom where you can ask your questions. Alternatively, you can send me privately in the chat function any questions if you have, but the Q&A section also allows upvoting. So if you do have a question, other people on the session have the opportunity to then upvote that question, so we can come to that one first. So I'd encourage you to use that Q&A function. So that's it from me. I'll now hand you over to our presenter for the day, Tonya. So Tonya, over to you. Here you go, Tonya.
Great, thank you. I hope everybody can hear me. I just want to thank Josh and the LSX team for hosting this webinar, and thanks everyone for attending. Great introduction, and look forward to presenting today. I'm going to advance the slide here. So as Josh mentioned, we're going to talk about reimbursement and market access planning, and the fact that it is not optional in terms of doing it in an early stage. And I want to present really a new narrative today for the medtech industry, and that is that reimbursement and market access strategy development done early in the product development life cycle is not optional. And I would say that it is as important as developing your regulatory strategy. And by not having a reimbursement and market access plan in place, you put your technology at risk for achieving market adoption and compromise your ability to raise funds necessary for market adoption. I think the notion that reimbursement and regulatory and clinical strategies are separate and distinct and siloed is false. And in fact, one should inform the other and should be developed and carried out in parallel. So with that, what we really want to do today is I want to impart the fundamentals and reimbursement of reimbursement and market access, again, focusing on the US marketplace in the context of early planning. Really help the attendees understand the importance of early planning and why reimbursement and market access should be integrated early in the process, and review some common industry misperceptions that I often hear, and throughout my career I've heard from clients and others in the industry, and identify some mistakes I've seen from those in the industry and how to avoid them. And then finally, review a best practice case study. So if we think about reimbursement, there are really two pathways. The one on the left for the existing pathway, which is for some of your commodity type of products or products that may not be new and novel, but still require a market access strategy plan and to really purport and to assess the value of the technology for the relevant stakeholder. So that's kind of what we call piggybacking off of existing reimbursement methodologies. In converse, on the right-hand side, we have the new technology pathway for new and novel technologies that are truly disruptive. And that requires a separate and distinct reimbursement pathway. So we're creating new coding mechanisms, we're establishing payment, and we're establishing coverage with third-party payers for reimbursement. It's important to know and understand that both of these processes require an evidence-based approach. And you'll hear me say over and over again throughout my talk that it is evidence-based. Reimbursement is truly evidence-based, not just on the economic side, but truly on the clinical value. So I'm a runner, and for those of you who like to run, I always ask this question: would you ever start training for a marathon 5 days before race day? And I would say, even if you aren't a runner, you would think that that's not a very good idea. So why would we not plan our reimbursement and market access strategy early? And why would we wait until the last minute, or even, unfortunately, waiting until we have FDA clearance or FDA approval? So it's very, very important, again, to really, throughout the life cycle, look at what is that strategic product plan and develop and understand who is your relevant stakeholder. What is that regulatory plan to, again, inform the reimbursement and market access plan to get to that market adoption. So again, very important throughout the product life cycle, all the way from regulatory, clinical to reimbursement. These are questions I often ask my clients very early on. And many times, unfortunately, they're not able necessarily to answer these questions or haven't really thought about them to this extent in terms of their devices or technologies. What is the strategic intent of your product? Is it to redefine the standard of care, the current standard of care? Is it a first-in-class or new procedure or treatment, revolutionizing maybe surgical care, or dramatically improving outcomes? So some of the examples here are minimally invasive glaucoma surgery, TAVR, Edwards TAVR, or the mechanical thrombectomy. Is it intended to improve clinical outcomes? It's reducing medical error or reducing post-operative care? Or is it reducing total cost of care, either intraoperatively or post-operatively? Is it reducing the total cost of a procedure that reduces maybe the time that's required to actually carry out the surgery or procedure, intraoperatively or post-operatively? Laparoscopic surgery is a really good example of that. Does it increase ease of use, or is it really being developed based on a competitive response from physicians, maybe KOLs who want that device to be used and developed? And the second question is, where does it fit in the treatment continuum? Where does your technology fit, and how will it disrupt current care pathways? This is really, really important. And I worked for a device company several years ago who spent 2.5 years before marketing their technology and getting it approved, really understanding how their technology would disrupt the care flow, the current care flow of the provider, and what the incentives were for the providers to actually adopt the technology. And then third, and I think very important, what is the unmet need? Is there an unmet need for this technology? So clearly answering these three key questions is imperative, again, early on in the process to inform that commercial and reimbursement and market access strategy. We all know that the US healthcare system is complex and certainly ever evolving. And it would be nice, and I often get this question a lot, or I think this assumption from clients is, reimbursement is not a linear process in the US. So it would be really nice if we just went to FDA, then we went to CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and then we had reimbursement and market access. So 1 + 1 would equal 2. Unfortunately, that's hardly the case, and I would say that this comic depicts really what the reality is. It is a maze. So you are, really after FDA approval, or you should be before, again, planning appropriately. But after you have FDA approval, it is truly a maze, and I would say an iterative process throughout the product life cycle. There are multiple stakeholders involved, and it's really important to understand and not assume that the stakeholder that is relevant for your technology, that the technology value proposition you've created is going to resonate with your relevant stakeholders. So we have facilities and hospitals, we have third-party payers, and there are many in the United States. We have health technology assessment companies who are assessing the clinical data that's available for the technologies. We have employers, and employers play a very big role in the US healthcare system in determining medical benefits, coverage, and financing of healthcare. We have the American Medical Association CPT, that's a coding editorial panel. We have specialty societies who are very involved in the reimbursement process. And of course, we have patients and physicians. So knowing the value propositions that resonate for all of these stakeholders is imperative. And every stakeholder has different requirements. We have this is a comparison of 3 different key stakeholders: the FDA, a payer, and a hospital system. The FDA evaluates a device for safety and efficacy. So they want to see, does that technology have efficacy in a controlled clinical study? Versus a health plan, they're evaluating the impact the device or the technology has on the health outcomes and its demonstrated effectiveness. So notice that I used efficacy for FDA and effectiveness for the health plans. They want to see, the payers want to see, does the technology improve the health benefits versus what's already established as a standard of care with published evidence. And this is really important. They want to see the evidence published. And as opposed to the hospital systems, they want to obviously see that there's a clinical benefit for patients, and they want to see a quantifiable financial benefit to the facility. So is there adequate reimbursement? Will there be an increased volume of procedures? Unfortunately, we are in a value-based healthcare system, but it is still based on fee-for-service largely. Is there a cost avoidance benefit, or is there minimal budget impact? Will that technology enhance the reputation of the hospital system? And is there strong physician demand for those physicians that will be using the technology at the facility? So it's important that an end-to-end evidence generation strategy meet all stakeholder requirements and consider their requirements. When we talk about reimbursement, there are 3 key fundamental concepts, and many of you have probably heard: coding, or coverage, coding, and payment. And while these are all interrelated, they are not interdependent, meaning that you can have one without the other. So you can have a code but not have coverage, for example. And we'll go into a bit more detail about each of these concepts as we move forward. But coverage really, by definition, is, does a third-party payer determine, what are they determining as medically necessary? Is the technology medically or reasonable and necessary for a patient population? Coding, it identifies what procedures were done or for the diagnosis they were done for. Those codes are submitted on a claim, sent to the third-party payer for reimbursement by the provider. And then the payment. There are different payment methods if we're talking about Medicare versus commercial payers, and they are contractually based oftentimes with the commercial payers in particular. So understanding each of these concepts and looking at them holistically rather than in a silo is really, really important. So the commercialization and reimbursement pathways for new and novel therapies really requires a significant commitment of time and resources and an understanding of what that entails throughout the process. It is a multi-year process for new and emerging technologies. Typically, it's anywhere from 5 to 7 years. And I'm not trying to scare anyone, but it is the reality that it is a process and an iterative one, as I mentioned before, that ebbs and flows throughout. So we need to, first of all, establish procedure demand and medical necessity on a case-by-case basis, oftentimes with temporary codes and temporary payment assignment. We need to build, at the same time, build evidence to support payer coverage, because we really want to get to that holy grail of payer coverage and full market adoption. We need to gain the specialty society support, and oftentimes there's more than one specialty society that we need to be engaging with. And then we need to move to permanent coding and payment assignment. So again, this is a stepwise process depicted here on the slide that again requires a commitment of time and resources. If you take away nothing from this presentation today, please know that continued evidence generation, both clinical and economic, is absolutely required for successful reimbursement and market access beyond what is needed for regulatory bodies. I have a lot of clients that come to me and to us indicating that they want to do the one pivotal study that will satisfy both FDA and it will satisfy all of the payers and all the other stakeholders. And that's just not reality. You need to continue to generate evidence to demonstrate the clinical and economic value of a technology, support and demonstrate health outcomes, generate claims that support premium or value-based pricing, and monetize the clinical benefits you're assessing in your trials. So what type of monetization can you do around if the procedure is more efficient? Does it reduce downstream costs, such as increased and additional office visits or additional procedures or complications, and the budget impact? And there are various designs that and different types of studies that you can do. Investigator-initiated studies are one, registry studies, retrospective analyses or real-world evidence, or even single-arm prospective studies and case series. So a compilation of those is always recommended and required. Establishing payer coverage, so getting into the coverage, coding, and payment schematic, is an evidence-based process. And if we think about the players at hand here, we have CMS, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, the agency that oversees and finances and administers the Medicare and Medicaid programs in the United States. CMS is the oversight body for Medicare, and that is health insurance for 65 age and older, or patients who are disabled or who have end-stage renal disease. And the Medicare program is administered by 12 Medicare administrative contractors, or MACs, throughout the country, as opposed to the Medicaid plans. That is an insurance for the indigent population and a lot of women and children. So there are 50 state Medicaid agencies, and they are all run very different in terms of reimbursement, payment methods, coverage methods, etc. So if we look at just consider the Medicare coverage mechanisms, you have CMS, who develops national coverage decisions, or NCDs. And usually they're under a protocol called with coverage with evidence development. So really what that means is CMS is assessing the technology over a period of time to determine is that will we really grant coverage for that technology? And oftentimes those CED protocols run for quite some time. And Medicare national decisions are binding on all MACs, all of the Medicare contractors, and they are really reserved for high profile, high impact, or controversial technologies. So in all essence, most technologies are truly covered under what we call an LCD, local coverage decision, which are essentially established by one of the 12 MACs. And they will establish LCDs to determine what is reasonable and necessary. And they may not actually even have formal local coverage decisions. They may just have reimbursement rules that are internal, that aren't published. And then the LCDs can differ across the MAC. So you can have one LCD for Noridian in California, and you can have a different one for Montana, for example. So they're not necessarily consistent. And then we have the commercial payers, which there are, again, several. This is just a highlight of the national plans, but we have the Blue Cross Blue Shield plans, which are all regional. We have Aetna, Humana, Cigna, and United Healthcare. And then these health plans, payers, are actually looking to utilization management companies such as Epicor, NIA Magellan, or health technology assessment groups, ECRI, UpToDate, to help them determine what their medical policies and inform their medical policies for new and emerging technologies. And in fact, you might be surprised to see NICE here. That is the UK body that assesses technologies. And oftentimes, all of these actual plans look to NICE and to determine and inform their medical policies. So they are looking across the pond, if you will. I think it's important to understand when we, when we think about payer coverage and their criteria. This is a really, this is an example of the former Blue Cross Blue Shield Association technology evaluation criteria. And I think it gives an appreciation for, again, the need for data beyond what's required for FDA approval. So the technology must have the final approval by the government regulatory bodies, in other words, FDA approved or cleared. The scientific evidence must permit conclusions concerning the effect on the technology of the technology and health outcomes, and they must improve the net health outcomes as opposed to the standard of care or other alternatives. And it must be as beneficial as any established alternatives. And finally, it must be attainable outside the investigational setting. In other words, in a real world setting or truly in clinical practice. And the point one of the key points I want to make here is for the appropriate patient population. So the payers, unlike FDA, oftentimes the regulatory strategy is in conflict with the reimbursement strategy, because with FDA, we want to make the indication very broad, whereas for the health plans and payers, they want to see a very clearly defined patient population that the technology will be beneficial for. So keep that in mind as we continue to move forward. Establishing coding is also an evidence-based process. So again, going back to our schematic from coverage, coding, and payment, it is an evidence-based process that is overseen by various organizations. And these code sets are used in different care settings. So for example, ICD-10 diagnosis codes, formerly ICD-9, are overseen and assigned in collaboration with the World Health Organization and CDC. Whereas procedure codes, both CPT and ICD-10, so they're ICD-10 diagnosis codes, and they're ICD-10 procedure codes. Though CPT codes in particular are assigned and owned and edited by the American Medical Association, whereas ICD-10 procedure codes are owned and edited and assigned by CMS. And finally, our product-specific codes, or HCPCS codes, those are assigned by CMS. So it's important to understand what care setting each of these codes are used in, and the specific agency or organizational body actually assigning and overseeing these code sets. Here's one kind of misperception we get, and what I've something I've heard along the years, is we just got 510(k) clearance and we just need to get a CPT code for reimbursement. That's all we need for reimbursement. We just need to get a code. Can you do that for us? And the first question I ask is, has a coding assignment been completed? Is a new code even needed? Remember the first slide I showed, is there something that already exists, a code or a payment mechanism, that this technology could fall into? The CPT process has evolved over the past several years, and often it is a requirement to establish a Category 3 code or use an unlisted code first until criteria for a Category 1 code is met. And I'll explain what these are in just a moment. And finally, does the technology have the required clinical data and specialty society support? So you're kind of seeing and getting the flavor that this is not just a, just a static application that you're submitting to the AMA. This is a process to establish a CPT code. So these are the different types of CPT codes, or current procedural terminology codes, that are used by both physicians and hospital providers for the outpatient setting. So again, by physicians and hospital outpatient providers. So the unlisted code really is a catch-all, and it is for new and emerging technologies if no other CPT code exists. So there's no payment assignment for this. It is a temporary code, again, until a new code is established, either a Category 1 or a 3, and it can be used immediately. Versus a Category 3 code, these were established about 10 years ago and represent new and emerging technologies. And honestly, 90% of new technologies begin with a Category 3 code. You do not have to have FDA clearance or approval or broad utilization, and these are often used during clinical trials strategically to track claims and cases and economic data. And they're often used early in commercialization. There is no payment assignment for these codes as well, and they are assigned every 6 months, again, by the AMA. A Category 1 code is kind of the holy grail of CPT codes. That's where you want to get to. This requires a significant amount of society support, broad utilization and adoption, and demonstrated in the published literature clinical effectiveness, as well as again, broad adoption, but it has to show that it's effective, and I'll go over the details in terms of what the criteria are in just a moment. There is permanent payment assignment for Category 1 codes because it goes through what's called the Relative Value Unit update process, and that takes about a year to go through that process. Therefore, the process is about an 18 to 24 months process from the time the AMA grants and checks and says, yes, this technology can get a Category 1 code. So it's a very lengthy process. Here is the criteria that's required for achieving a Category 1 code assignment. The professional society, as I mentioned, needs to support the code, or multiple societies. It must be FDA approved or cleared, and the procedure must be performed by many physicians across the country. You need to have also a minimum of 5 peer-reviewed publications for the distinct service, and one of those publications must be exclusive to the US population, and at least 2 studies without overlapping patient populations. And then you can see finally here the level of evidence that's required for each of these 5 publications has to be at least a 2A. One has to be at least a 2A. So very significant requirements. Again, it is not just a static application that you submit. It is a very politically charged process, and I tell clients that the CPT process is about 90% politics and 10% policy. Some of the considerations with coding and coverage, and this might be intuitive to some, but even if you have a code, it doesn't guarantee coverage. So just because you have a valid code doesn't mean the payers are going to cover it. Remember that the coding is established by various bodies, CMS, AMA, World Health Organization, whereas for payer coverage, it is determined by the various payer entities based on whether or not that technology is medically necessary based on the published clinical outcomes. So finally, we get into the payment piece. And there are various payment assignment and methodologies that exist in the US. And we'll use Medicare as an example because it is a baseline and this is published information. And many other US payers, commercial payers in particular, use Medicare payment methodologies and fee schedules as a baseline. So each different care setting has a different type of payment methodology. So for physicians, there's the Medicare physician fee schedule. The methodology that's used is relative value units. So there is a relative value unit assigned to each CPT code, one for work, to determine how long does it take the physician to perform the technology, what is the time, the skill, the stress, as well as the practice expense component. How much does it cost the physician to actually perform the service? And then the hospital inpatient payment methodology is the Inpatient Prospective Payment System, or IPPS. The methodology that's used is a DRG, and DRGs have a prospective payment assignment assigned to them. There are also, and I'll go into this just in a minute, a little bit further, there are temporary payment methodologies in the IPPS system called the New Technology Add-on Payment, or NTAP. And again, I'll go into this in just a moment. And that is a temporary payment assignment that new technologies could be subject to if they meet the criteria. And then finally, on the hospital outpatient side, or in the ambulatory surgery center, the fee schedule methodology is the Hospital Outpatient Prospective Payment System, or OPPS. And very similar to the IPPS, it uses ambulatory payment classification groups, which have an assigned payment. And the procedures that are assigned to each of these APC groups are similar clinically and similar from a cost standpoint. Very similar to the IPPS, there are also temporary payment methods called transitional pass-through for new technologies. Again, temporary, and I'll go into this in just a moment. And you can see also, just finally, that each of these individual care settings have a different coding mechanism. So for physicians, we have CPT, HCPCS, and ICD-10 diagnosis codes. For hospital inpatient, we have ICD procedure and diagnosis codes. And hospital outpatient, we have CPT, HCPCS, and ICD-10 diagnosis codes. So this is another and more recent statement that we hear from clients quite often nowadays with the breakthrough status. So we just got breakthrough status with the FDA. So now we have coverage and reimbursement with Medicare. So I want to make sure that we all understand that breakthrough status does not equal coverage. So it does not mean that Medicare is going to cover the procedure. And I know it sounds counterintuitive, but I'll explain in just a moment. Breakthrough status also does not mean permanent payment. And I'll explain in just a second what I mean by that. CMS offers a temporary payment method for certain technologies that might meet criteria. So I mentioned a few minutes ago the NTAP payment methodology, or the transitional pass-through payment methodology. So oftentimes these breakthrough devices will meet the criteria for these temporary payment assignments. And one thing that I think part of the confusion, where the confusion comes in, is CMS recently changed its criteria for devices who have breakthrough status from the FDA for the NTAP payment or the transitional pass-through. So previously, to meet the criteria for an NTAP, the technology had to be new, so it needed to meet the newness criteria. It needed to meet a certain specific cost criteria, and it also needed to meet substantial clinical evidence criteria, so better than what was already available in the marketplace. On the hospital outpatient side, the technology had to be new, meet the newness criteria, as well as the cost criteria, and also clinical evidence criteria, or substantial clinical evidence criteria. And it also cannot already be appropriately described by any of the existing APC categories, okay? So what had happened was CMS, about a year and a half ago, changed the NTAP criteria for devices that had breakthrough designation. So those devices do not need to meet the newness criteria, they already meet it. And they also meet the substantial clinical evidence criteria. But they need to still meet the cost criteria. Same thing on the outpatient side, these breakthrough devices still need to meet the newness criteria and the cost criteria. So I think that was part of the confusion in the industry that CMS had made these changes to accommodate the breakthrough status. But again, these are temporary payment assignments, these are not permanent, and they do not equal coverage. And in particular, this is an excerpt from the CMS Medicare manual stating exactly that the fact that a drug, device, procedure, or service is assigned a HCPCS code or a CPT code and a payment rate under the outpatient payment system or the inpatient prospective payment system does not imply coverage by the Medicare program, but indicates only how the product, procedure, or service may be paid if it's covered by the program. So again, counterintuitive, but we go back to that schematic of coverage, coding, and payment, and we see now how they're all intersecting and how they all interrelate. So again, you can have one without the other. For anyone who wants to learn more about the breakthrough device designation and the payment structures, my colleague and I wrote an article that was published a few months ago, and the link is right here, and I'll actually send to the LSX team as well to share with the audience. So what does it take to build a successful U.S. reimbursement and market access strategy? This is just a summary of what I've been referring to today, and that's really, again, assessing who your stakeholders are pre-commercial. What are their incentives? How are they going to view this technology? What data and information do they need to incentivize them to adopt the technology? And then building that evidence, building your plan, your pricing plan, your go-to commercial plan, and then executing that plan and continually iterating that plan throughout the product life cycle, and then getting into the commercial state, defending that plan as you move forward. So again, early strategic product planning informs the reimbursement and market access strategy and really serves as the key foundation to product commercialization. So you might be asking yourself, well, how in the world, Tanya, do new technologies get paid upon FDA approval or clearance? How can they develop and attain the appropriate clinical and economic evidence necessary for broad coverage, coding, and payment? How can they demonstrate and document patient and physician demand in case volume? And how can we get formal coverage maybe on a case-by-case basis until we have the data where we can get formal coverage? And how do we garner that society support? This slide I showed to you earlier, and really, again, a lot of times new technologies have to establish an integrated patient access program or something similar. You might have heard of a reimbursement support program whereby these technologies are being assessed and facilitated from a reimbursement standpoint on a case-by-case basis. So we're arguing medical necessity on a case-by-case basis. And this depiction is what I call the bottom-up, top-down approach. So as you're working on a case-by-case basis to establish medical necessity, as well as obtaining that case-by-case volume, accruing data during the ID and even post-regulatory approval to leverage for policy changes, we're at the same time working with the payer policy team at the different payers who are looking at, a population-based type of outcome. Where is the published evidence, the clinical patient selection criteria, and coding guidance? So this top-down, bottom-up approach using an integrated patient access program with a data infrastructure is a full manifestation of the reimbursement strategy, i.e. coding, coverage, and payment, and getting to that ultimate market adoption goal. So some of the common mistakes I've seen in the industry over the years, and some of the ways how to avoid them. Common mistakes I've seen is a full focus on the regulatory and R&D plan with no attention to developing the reimbursement and market access strategy until FDA approval or clearance is granted. So it's this kind of wait game of, well, once we have FDA approval or clearance, then we'll think about reimbursement. As you know, as you've heard me say throughout this presentation, it is imperative to assess the landscape early and develop that strategy. Not understanding the current workflows or where your technology will fit and how it's going to truly disrupt the current care continuum. Again, taking the time pre-commercial to truly understand where your technology fits in the current care pathways and what the benefit it brings to the various stakeholders. Building your clinical and market access strategy on an indication that is too broad. I mentioned this earlier, that oftentimes the regulatory indication is in conflict with the payer coverage strategy. We want to really identify a finite patient population that the technology can benefit, and articulate that to the payers, as well as accrue the data that shows that benefit. And then misunderstanding or making assumptions on the payment methods and benefits and coverage criteria and even the economics of the buyer. Not everybody is in a fee-for-service type of world, and we need to really understand what is the organizational structure of the providers that we're going to be marketing the technology to and who will be using the technology. What are their financial incentives? What will it take for them to adopt the technology? I had a client come to me very early on, and it was lucky that they did. They had a technology that was actually, it turned out to actually be a benefit exclusion by Medicare. So this was an early technology that was just in the pre-commercial or in the preclinical stage, and it was good that I advised the client early on, because it allowed that client to change the actual technology from an R&D standpoint, and even their thoughts and assumptions around the regulatory and the reimbursement strategy. So there could be benefit exclusions that don't even allow your technology to be covered and paid for, even on a case-by-case basis. And then assuming the landscape today will remain static for commercialization of future technologies. For technologies that are in the IDE phase, it's, they won't be commercialized for 2 to 3 years. So really keeping a pulse on how is your disease area, the relevant disease area, evolving, and are they going to maybe a centers of excellence type of model? How are the payment mechanisms evolving and changing? Really important to understand that it's not going, the environment and ecosystem may not look exactly the same as it does today. And then lastly, not having an end-to-end evidence generation strategy and publication plan. I've mentioned this before, stopping with only what's needed for regulatory approval or 510(k) clearance. Failure to articulate a clear value proposition, again, that resonates to all relevant stakeholders, and applying a one-size-fits-all value proposition. I've seen many clients assume that there's a payer, that the payers will love their technology because it's going to reduce costs, when essentially the actual buyer of the technology, being the hospital, that value proposition resonates with them more than it does with the payers. Okay, so understanding what the relevant stakeholders, what value proposition resonates with each of the stakeholders. And then conducting early market research with only friends and family for voice of customer feedback. And I've seen this happen time and again, where the medical technology company gets their scientific advisory board together, and it's all paid consultants, and they're giving them all of the feedback that they all of the kind of, rose-colored glasses feedback. Everything's great. There's no kind of, devil's advocate going on. You always want to get the advice and feedback from your proponents as well as your opponents. And then making an uninformed pricing strategy based on the current Medicare reimbursement amounts, and demanding that your technology deserves a premium price without evidence to support that. So in order to develop a pricing strategy, you really need to look at not only the current reimbursement amounts, but what retrospectively, if you can do a claims analysis to see what is for that disease state or that actual procedure, what are the current charges and costs? And then, what is the market going to bear? Again, based on the organizational structures you're selling into. So the pricing strategy is more than just looking at what the Medicare reimbursement amounts are. I want to share kind of finally a best in practice case study, and this is Glaukos. It is a company based here in Southern California, and they developed the iStent technology used to treat intraocular pressure in glaucoma patients. It was the first of its kind, and then so they were essentially establishing a new treatment class known as the minimally invasive glaucoma surgery. They were FDA approved in 2012. But Glaukos had been planning their reimbursement and market access strategy much earlier, about 3 years earlier, in the R&D and regulatory phase, and continued through its IDE and developed and carried out those strategies. They established a Category 3 code, pre-PMA and accrued data during their IDE study. They continued their evidence generation plan throughout the product life cycle. They were engaging early with payers and their providers as well. And they strategically worked with the Specialty Society to establish those Category 3 codes and have numerous publications to date. And so today, they actually still have those Category 3 codes, which have payment assigned because they've been in place for so long, and they have broad coverage as well with the payers. So a great example of a technology that, and a leadership team that really thought about things very early on, and it served them very well in the marketplace today with the success that they've had. This is just a last quote that I'll leave you with from a CEO from Virtus Medical. And he states very succinctly that traditionally early commercialization strategies have focused on regulatory approvals, product and market fit, and pricing, and that an explicit reimbursement and market access strategy focused on coverage, coding, and reimbursement or payment must be added to the list. Developing the right data plan of interest to payers, as well as having active engagement with the key societies that are responsible for the code and advocating for reimbursement, are vital in the early stages of product development. Failure to do so will significantly increase the risk of commercialization failure. And he speaks firsthand from experience. He's been through the trenches and has been through a lot with his technology, but still continues on. But he wanted me to impart this this message to the attendees today. And you'd have thought I wrote it myself, but I didn't. So thought I would add that here. That concludes my presentation. Josh, I think we can turn it over to Q&A at this time.
Yes, indeed. Thanks so much, Tonya. Wonderful presentation there, and I think some people have already indeed commented on that and how clear and I guess detailed that presentation was. We do have a number of questions to get to. If any of you who haven't yet asked your question have any, please do put them into the Q&A section now, and we'll look to get to everyone's question if we can in the next sort of 10 minutes or so before the end of the session. So Rosina, who was impressed by the presentation, had a question herself. She said, are there recent changes in coverage of Category 3 codes by major payers? CMS made some vague warnings about this, but not sure if these have any bite.
Yeah, and to answer the question, it's a good one. There have been, in terms of changes, CMS had made a change that required the Medicare contractors to actually provide a rationale of why the Category 3 codes were not covered, or procedures that were defined by the Category 3 codes. So previously, the Medicare contractors in particular would, and commercial payers as well, would take the Category 3 codes and put them onto what I call the naughty list, non-covered services list, or non-covered services LCD. And that change from CMS went into place last year, whereby the MACs are now required to provide a rationale of why they are on that non-covered services list. So I hope that answers the question.
Fantastic. And Sebastian Bouchard had a question. In order to speed up the process of obtaining a reimbursement code as quickly as possible across the United States, so NCD, would you recommend concentrating our efforts in deploying devices in one specific region or in each regions of the US?
Well, I think the question is related to, is there a way to expedite the Category 1 or Category 3 CPT code process? And again, if we go back to that coding, coverage, and payment, pyramid, I think what the question, and I'll answer the question in this way, it's always advised to do a limited launch regionally before you try to scale broadly. So you get the traction in one region of the marketplace, again, from not just a coding perspective, but coverage and payment perspective. So, so definitely advised to do more of a regional launch initially. We call it a limited launch.
Fantastic. A question here from an anonymous listener. Do you see a benefit in terms of reimbursement based on a company's regulatory strategy? For example, if a company chooses a PMA pathway and therefore there is a regulatory required clinical, does that help reimbursement, or are they too independent? You mentioned that you have they have different needs in terms of goals, but are there any other benefits?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and one that often comes up. So if we think about the 510K clearance process and even 510K de novo, a 510K simply means that the FDA has given the manufacturer the green light to market and commercialize the technology. There's really no data requirement at all, at least for a traditional 510K. Versus with a pre-market approval or PMA, you do need to obtain and conduct a pivotal study. And so there is a benefit certainly from having that data and evidence that's needed for the broader masses, including the payers, and being able also to accrue that cost data and clinical data during that IDE study that will help with reimbursement and market access after commercialization. So there definitely is a benefit in conducting a PMA type of trial or going through a PMA process versus the 510K. But it's always that catch-22. A lot of device innovators will look to the 510K process as obviously a quicker way to market, but it oftentimes has, it does have significant implications if it's a new and emerging technology on the reimbursement post-commercialization.
Fantastic. Rutger had a question. What can be the beneficial influence of a NICE recommendation on US reimbursement decisions? You mentioned that earlier in the talk, but what's the beneficial influence of a particular NICE recommendation from NICE here in the UK on US reimbursement decisions?
Yeah, it's a good question too. The NICE, the NICE process is pretty sophisticated, and it not only assesses the clinical evidence, but also the economic evidence and value for technologies. Unlike in the US, there's really not a consistent methodology to do that. And in the UK with NICE, it's very centralized for the NHS. So there is a benefit because they are doing that economic analysis in conjunction with the clinical assessment. And I think though, if you have a positive NICE recommendation, which is looked to and considered by, again, as I mentioned, really most of the health plans here in the US, and then you also have on top of it positive assessments by the health technology assessment groups here in the US that are evolving to from a kind of a static assessment to more of a dynamic assessment, real time, it is a benefit.
Fantastic. Eliane had a question. Are there any different rules for coverage and payment for humanitarian devices?
Yes, for humanitarian devices, there's definitely a different regulatory pathway. And there's oftentimes different considerations provided, and because it is a smaller patient population, and but it really depends on the patient population we're talking about. And so if we're, for example, looking at more of a Medicare patient population versus more of a Medicaid patient population, there's going to be different coverage mechanisms and payment mechanisms based on the Medicaid versus the Medicare. I will say that there was a technology that was approved and in the ophthalmology space that was used to treat a very finite patient population as a HUD, and they actually got a NTAP, National or New Technology Add-on Payment, as I mentioned earlier, but did not have coverage by the Medicare contractors. So that can happen, but it's important really early on to understand what the payer mix is for the patient population at hand.
Wonderful. I'm going to try and combine a couple of questions we've had here, one from Robert Glenn and another from an anonymous attendee. So Robert asked for a UK company, and I guess this question really could relate to any non-US company, I suppose, but for a UK company, can this engagement with US processes be managed from the UK, or in reality, does it need a staff member in the US doing the work? And I guess the second question, which is somewhat related, is how much more difficult, or I guess do you see it as more difficult for non-US companies to penetrate the US market successfully? And would your strategy need to change in any way, do you think, for a non-US medical device company?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And actually at Micro, we have several OUS companies that we work with. And so it's certainly, to answer the first part of the question, it certainly can be managed. Is it ideal to have the entire group in the UK or OUS and working with them that way? We can do that. It would be nice to have constituencies here in the US to kind of bridge that gap and to augment the team OUS. So that's an ideal situation. And I would say that if you have, that's the ideal situation that would allow, I think, to answer the second part of the question, to allow a more seamless commercialization and really understanding of the marketplace here in the US and regionally, because it's you just can't replace looking at reading information and with somebody who has feet on the street and really understands the marketplace very well. And I'll give a good example of myself working. I've worked on on OUS reimbursement policies for J&J, and having somebody on the ground and that knew the markets inside and out for the various countries was imperative. So I think it definitely can be done, but ideally you want to have somebody here as well to augment the OUS team.
We have quite a few questions still, so we'll see what we can get through maybe, but I'm sure also afterwards they'll be quite happy to have some follow up with Tonya and answer some of these questions, and I'll make sure that they get sent over. Adriano has asked that you recommended identifying the technology solution benefits based on ICD-10, DIGS, etc. Or DIGS ETC. What is the source of truth for those, since there is a degree of variance across payers?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question. Is it identifying the procedures that are identified by an ICD-10 code?
You recommended identifying the technology solution benefits based on ICD-10. Perhaps that's a...
maybe I'll take that one offline, because I'm not... Yeah, I'm not sure. Can you send that to me, Josh, please, offline? I want to make sure I follow up, because I'm not sure I'm really understanding the question. I don't want to answer it the wrong way.
We have a question. A lot of clinicians are reluctant to use 99 HCPC codes because of the additional paperwork, as it can be a pain. Is it easier for them to use Category 3 codes?
Well, those are two distinctly different code sets. So Category 3 codes are used to identify a procedure, so a device that's used as part of the procedure. And remember that Category 3 codes are established by the American Medical Association. It's still advised to have society support for those coding constructs for Category 3, but they're not necessarily just used for the specific device. So as opposed to HCPCS codes, those are used for specific device designations, so for DME or for the actual device itself, and oftentimes are assigned, I should say, if that technology or device has pass-through status under the outpatient prospective payment system. The paperwork is onerous, and it used to be a yearly process, and they've changed it to be a quarterly process of assignment. So I would say that the paperwork essentially is somewhat the same, but again, those are two distinct code sets used for different purposes.
Perfect. And perhaps, yeah, just one more sort of question that we can answer live on the webinar here as we have come towards the end here, and then everything else I'm sure can be taken offline and followed up with the participants who've asked those questions. But Charlotte has asked, does the coding process apply to medical devices that can be used at home by patients, such as glucose meters?
Yeah, so it is the same type of coding assignment process. The payment methodologies and coverage methodologies differ. And unfortunately, you know, we were previously in a state where there were a lot of developments happening with digital technologies for in-home use or at-home monitoring that were, you know, either CPT related or HCPCS code related. And with COVID, it has expedited the assignment, and I would say payment assignments also for those procedures. And so we did a whole webinar on this a few weeks ago, but certainly can provide more information. But it's trying to fit new digital technology into kind of the traditional reimbursement pathway. And it's important also to understand that even if you have a code for a technology or device, you again may not have coverage and payment for it. So always keeping that in mind. But there are methodologies and assessments we can do to determine what those pathways look like.
Fantastic. Well, yeah, we've, as you suggested, you did get a lot of questions as we thought you might. We will make sure to pass these questions on to Tonya and hopefully follow up with some of you if you did have some questions and feed that back. As many people have asked as well, if we will have the presentation slides and the recording itself, yes, we'll be sending that out to everyone who was registered, because obviously we know, of course, it's different time zones for everyone and not everyone can join live, so they will be coming to you as well. So thank you to all of you for joining us today. Huge thank you to Tonya, of course, for sharing her expertise with you all. And I'm sure any sort of content to the question or any follow-up questions that you might have, or if you have any questions about how Mukra can help you and your businesses, then yeah, there'll be some follow-up coming on that front as well. As I mentioned at the start of the webinar, this is the second webinar in our series with Mukra. The third webinar will take place on Thursday, June 18th, and is titled Navigating MDR Expectations for Tomorrow, based on notified body feedback today. So the session will sort of focus on different clinical study design options to collect clinical data necessary to obtain and maintain CE marking under the EU MDR. So we'll be following up with that email with the links in there, a link to sign up to that webinar if you're not already. And I'll also speak to Tonya about getting a link for the article that she mentioned, which I think a couple of people specifically asked for about the breakthrough technologies, and we can hopefully include that in there as well. So thank you all. Thank you, Tonya, and hopefully see you all again in 3 weeks' time.
Thanks, everyone. Stay well.